Good afternoon. Hello and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Multilateral Federation Guidance from Microsoft and its Potential Impact on the R&E Community. We appreciate you joining today for IAM Online for our very first webinar of a new year. We are very excited to be kicking off with today's program. There you'll see the agenda and topics for this afternoon, and you'll be hearing more about that shortly as folks are joining. A few items to remind you about as we are getting underway. We will be taking questions live using the Zoom Q&A function. So please send those messages there during the presentations. We want this to be interactive, but we will be using that function. So we'll ask that you post your questions there throughout today's presentation. Feel free to post messages in chat, but that won't be our main mechanism for taking audience questions. In addition, we are recording this webinar. If you registered for IM Online, you will receive the link to the recording and the slides. We aim to have that available within 48 hours after the webinar, and you'll also find it on our YouTube channel. So once again, we are recording, and you will receive those materials. They'll also be posted on the incommon.org website. With that, I am happy to pass the virtual podium to our moderator for the afternoon, Mary McKee, Senior Director of Engineering at InCommon Catalyst Cirrus Identity, to tell you more about this afternoon's presentation.
Great, thanks, April. Let me go ahead and take over the slide deck from here. All right, so as April mentioned, I'm Mary McKee. I'm the Senior Director of Engineering at Cirrus Identity, and I am joined here today by Corey Lee, Security CTO of Microsoft Education, Stephen Tyser and Selena Riz from the University of Arkansas, and David Warden and Jack Truckenmiller from SUNY Geneseo. So before we get too far into it, I wanted to kind of introduce and set the stage for Corey to talk. I know Corey the way that a lot of you know Corey, which is that prior to working at Cirrus Identity, I worked for a university that had a Microsoft engagement. And, you know, Corey's everywhere. He was at our campus, just like he's at your campus, and, you know, checking to make sure that things were going well. And things were going well for the most part. But as an IAM director, the fly in the soup for me was that it was not clear that we were going to get the multilateral federation support that we needed to make sure we accounted for, which is something that very few people really have a good grasp on, but everyone would notice in our community if it was broken. Corey understood that need, and I wanted him to fix it. And Corey wanted us to kind of say, okay, well, you know, we kind of need to see like, what does the whole community need so that Microsoft can respond to that ask. I said, well, that's ridiculous. We all obviously want the same thing. And to prove that to you, I am going to volunteer as the co-chair for the InCommon work group for identity providers as a service. We're just going to write it up. It'll be super quick. Corey can just take it from there. Except it turns out that Corey was not wrong. It took us months just to define what we even meant by a cloud-based identity provider. And ultimately, we ended up having to reduce like a large spectrum of things into 4 different buckets, which were all pretty complicated except for one of them. In the end, what we ended up doing with the final report, which you can read in the InCommon workgroup materials, is to focus on the solution that is not complicated. And that is something that the workgroup called a federation adapter. Federation adapter is just a lightweight kind of add-on that you would put onto your commercial IDP to make sure that if it doesn't support multilateral federation, that it can support multilateral federation. That is an obvious place to start in terms of making sure that people in our community can continue to access resources while we have conversations about those other 3 buckets. So that's a quick summary of years worth of work. The community was defining common needs. Cirrus Identity had launched a federation adapter product in the Cirrus Bridge that was gaining a lot of traction. And Microsoft was doing nothing. Just kidding, Corey. Actually, Microsoft was doing a lot, but I will turn it over to Corey to talk about that in just a moment. In the meantime, I do want to say that I think it's very exciting. We're going to talk kind of about the past, go through two community stories with Arkansas and SUNY Geneseo, and then we're going to kind of turn it back over to talk about the future since this is an ongoing conversation. But I think it's really exciting to see sort of these conversations happen where I've seen it from the university side. I'm now getting to see it from the Cirrus side, which I had kind of watched from afar for a while. And I'd like to turn it over to Corey to talk about what was happening on the Microsoft side during those early days.
Well, you mentioned a couple things though of Microsoft not doing nothing, which is not doing anything, which is a common theme, especially that we hear in a number of different areas. But as Mary mentioned, I'm the security CTO for U.S. Education, and how Mary and I got connected was squarely as described. Uh, we being Microsoft heard on a number of fronts, hey, we want to leverage solutions that Microsoft offers, but you are not doing enough to meet education and identity requirements, or identity and education requirements. And interesting enough that that comment and statement came up so often. Recently, I moved into the security CTO role, but prior to that, I like to say I grew up at Microsoft a little bit in the identity space and education. And most of that happened to be related to working on complex identity solutions, specifically out in the field for K-12 and higher education customers, mostly focused on identity management and in some cases, role-based access and identity federation scenarios. So, some of the things that Mary had described in these early conversations, were near and dear to me, but also I understand how those types of statements and comments can get overlooked, especially at a company like Microsoft. So when we hear things like, hey, Microsoft isn't doing enough, I know from experience that you kind of have to peel back the onion. You got to understand what is going on there. And I'll take you on a brief journey of just some of what I've learned and what I've seen since I've moved into the capacity of trying to understand what our education customers experience on the identity front, and how that translates to other areas that they are exploring, whether that be related to productivity, cloud adoption, security, etc. And one thing that we heard, as I stated, was we can't use what we own, right? You sold us a thing A3, A5, or some random thing, and we can't use it. And that kind of spawned additional conversations around, well, why, right? At which point, it became extremely interesting to hear that, in some cases, there were differences in what the problem was. And in some cases, it was, hey, we don't have identity integration. In other cases, hey, we don't have guidance and documentation. Or in other cases, it might have been, we just don't have time, right? We need help, people, which oftentimes turned into information being passed along to other folks at Microsoft to help, right? Support and engineering. But then there was another lane of conversations that were squarely related to research, right? Hey, we're really trying to leverage Azure, or we're trying to expand our footprint from a compute perspective, and we're running into issues. And for a while, I would say, I think there were differences in ideas around what the real problem was, but this was nonetheless a piece of feedback and a concern. And then lastly, hearing things like, as I stated earlier, Microsoft really doesn't care about education, identity and education. We've provided feedback over the years. It's fell on deaf ears. We keep getting asked the same questions over and over again. And I actually kind of wrote that on a sticky note one day, the 100th time that I heard it, to say, okay, there is a fundamental clarity problem here, right? Now, you hear three themes from me today. One is clarity, and something that Mary mentioned about documentation that started to become very helpful in the context of getting people to understand complex topics that, quite frankly, I don't think were fully ever really understood. and led to a lot of the things that never happened or in the past. But in addition to that, it created measurable things to track, right? And here is where, when we start to think about some of the problems, or things that changed over time, there was this interesting, we'll call it, observation, which turned out to be concepts from an identity perspective in education oftentimes get misconstrued in engineering teams. Things like trust frameworks, things like the term federation, um, things like referencing identity providers like Shibboleth. You'd be surprised, but maybe it's not a surprise. But um, one thing that I learned over time was a lot of the quote unquote identity and education conversation at Microsoft historically was wrapped around Shibboleth and the notion that identity and education was shibboleth, right? Which, I think for the folks on this line, understand that that's not the case, but this just, describes a little bit of the how entities can talk past one another, but also how common terms that some believe maybe are understood and concepts can be misunderstood. In addition to that, we faced a number of conversations with customers around, for anyone who's been tracking over the past 3 to 5 years or so, supply chain attacks and exploits against hybrid identity architectures, complex identity architectures, which, kind of putting on one of the hats that I wear on a day-to-day basis, which is responding to incident response activities across education. This shined another light on, hey, what do we truly understand about identity architectures in education, especially when we encounter complex identity compromise scenarios, whether that's revolving, things like token theft, credential theft, or, various other types of attack types. This was something, that ultimately got more people wanting to pay attention. And then lastly, just the adoption of cloud kind of really increasing, as I mentioned earlier, customers that would say things like, hey, we're using 10% of our current cloud, but we need to use more for capacity reasons, or we need to use more to get to more emerging scenarios. So, all things considered, we went from, in my opinion, a place where there was a lot of misunderstanding, lack of clarity, to having a bit more clarity, but also some direction, which resulted in some things that we'll talk a little bit more about today. But to highlight, um, as Mary mentioned, there's a bit of a journey that I know that the Microsoft team is on to once again fully understand the R&E requirements, to fully understand identity architectures in education. And I'm squarely in the middle of that, but proud to announce that there are some things that are happening that have been done. One of which being, the launch of an identity and education community approximately a year and a half ago or so, to really document and to serve as the focus for how do we understand the many nuances of identity and education, and specifically those that apply to R&E. In addition to that, looking at, as we talk about this adapter conversation and how do we use cloud-based identity providers and so forth, what does that mean to really start to take strides to partner with the community and partners of the community to better create integrations that support enterprise architectures. And then lastly, to put the our money where our mouths are, and to start to release capabilities that support education and identity and education scenarios. And you hear some of this throughout the talk today, but things like when we hear scenarios, hey, we can't use Azure AD because we can't restrict the attributes, we can't make them private, we can't use the fundamental directory, we need some assistance there. That feedback doesn't necessarily always fall on deaf ears. I know in the past it has, but delighted to state here, that your feedback has translated to capabilities being released to support scenarios that we learn about, but the job isn't done, right? So as we kind of start to build upon things like confidential attributes and what can be done to extend and integrate with external attribute stores, and to get better at mastering attributes and performing attribute release, and getting a lot of the other requirements kind of lined up to support end-to-end use cases, that things like multilateral federation reference architectures can be augmented, updated, expanded, but mostly to support ensuring we cover down on the use cases, the scenarios, and the requirements of the community. And that's, hopefully we intend that we can continue that journey because we know the job isn't done. So Mary, I think as it stands, we know we've had some road bumps, and we've made some strides, but I'm interested to hear kind of what are some of the customer stories and scenarios that we've embarked upon, and how do we continue that journey?
Yeah, thanks, Corey. And I think we're about to get into two customer stories, community stories that I think are similar in that both campuses use Entra ID and the Cirrus Bridge, but that's kind of where the similarities end. And sometimes it's easier to kind of show rather than tell, going back to that point Corey made about sort of defining what are the patterns, what's common. I also want to say, Corey, and I've had my moments of skepticism, but for me, the really big Microsoft putting your money where your mouth is moment is publishing the reference architecture information, acknowledging this product does not support this. We understand that this community cares about this. And even just defining that was what I was looking for, is if we can just understand that you don't support that, then we can move on with the problem. But you can't solve a problem you can't define. And I think we've made some really great strides there. So in terms of our community stories, let's move on. And I think we'll first talk about the University of Arkansas story. So I will turn it over to Stephen Tyther and Selena Riz, if you would like to introduce yourselves, kind of let us know what was your organization's challenge, what was the driving force from a business perspective of taking this on. Let us know what you had before and after, and then let us know, the community, I'm sure, would like to hear advice or lessons learned about what went well and what didn't go well. So with that, we can get into the University of Arkansas introductions.
Okay. Do you want me to go first, Tyson?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Selena Riz. I'm Associate CIO for Enterprise Service Management. I've been with the University of Arkansas for coming up on 5 years. And before that, I worked in corporate America. So higher ed as a whole was relatively new to me, but what an amazing journey we're on. So to start out with some of our challenges, Mary, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so the University of Arkansas adopted Shibboleth in early 2004. And over the years, as requirements have changed, and I mean, from a business process standpoint, from what students want to learn, and also from the vast diversity of what our research community offers, we recognized that we needed to shift and have a process that was more nimble. And so as a part of that, because we are an R1 institution and in some regard leading the UA system through our identity and access management journey, we realized that we needed multilateral federation to be successful, to be agile and nimble. Strategically, our approach was highly collaborative. We put the users first. We met with our library constituents, our asynchronous learning arm of the university, which is called Global Campus. We met with the law school because they have diverse requirements that are very specific to that college's offerings. And it was very important to us to shift the culture to become student engaged first and create a better business process, and obviously open those requirements so that our constituents, our faculty, staff, and students could utilize systems more in a more agile way. Stephen?
So I'm Stephen Tyser. I'm the CISO for the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. I think realistically, we were on the journey, identity was an issue for us. It has been for a long time, as Selena mentioned. Um, we were on a journey, a cloud first journey with Microsoft, and we found that system wide, right? And the university system has more than 20 other schools in it. Most of them have, 2,000, 5,000 students, and maybe two or three IT individuals, right? So one of the things that was to get all of the system schools to enter ID and to move away from our, that architecture that we've held on to for many years with Active Directory and the bridge between Active Directory on-prem and Entra ID, right? And then looking at that and how that functioned with the other schools around the state as well. Really, we were working with Microsoft about this. They were proposing some ideas, and then they brought up Cirrus. We were also working on a statewide research network as well at the time, and that became, our test bed for this. So we did a POC with Cirrus, put Cirrus Bridge in place, and started working with that. It worked very well for us, and the level of management with Cirrus's engagement and their help there was, right where we really needed to be. And that's one of our goals in this was also to develop a system not only that can be run by a school with, hundreds of IT individuals, but, run in those smaller schools that don't have 100 IT individuals, that really has two or three. And so that was part of this, getting Cirrus in here, getting the sample bridge set up. That was part of what started the POC and the research in the statewide research network, and then translated down into our journey as a campus in University of Arkansas Fayetteville. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Implementation overview. Go ahead. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so Stephen, you'll have to keep me honest here. Through our current, well, I can't say current anymore because we've implemented it. So our recent past architecture looked similar to what you're saying. We had multiple communication channels back and forth from the UI identity providers. You obviously see Microsoft Entra ID, and then that connected to our Active Directory, our LDAP, and Shibboleth, and then the service providers. So through the scope of our transition and working with Cirrus is we identified those 50 to 75, closer to 75 applications that were dependent on SHIB that we needed to have in scope for this significant milestone and this implementation. What we learned was through the modification of some of the business processes, significant increase in cybersecurity complexity and requirements, we had a significant amount of room for error. And in the shifting requirements, it was really important for us to take a focus or to take a moment of pause to recognize what those complexities were, how we engaged and remedied some of the institutional risks that we were facing. And so we needed Cirrus to bring this to light, but also as we were embarking on our journey, it was really important to identify, document some of these requirements and this transition of data and information. And that brings us to our post-implementation architecture that Stephen is going to walk us through right now.
Right. I think one of the things you can see, and one of the things that Selena mentioned is that we were an early adopter. We did not have a lot of documentation, right? I mean, this was 2004. We're a university, which means we've had 50 people transition through this role of IAM manager over those few years, right? And so, and I'm being facetious with 50, it just feels like that. But anyway, so we didn't have really good documentation. We did not have a lot of knowledge of that. So That was one of our issues. And then you saw in the other slide, the stack at the bottom was huge, complex, had a lot of software that we had to manage, maintain, and update. We really were on this, journey with Microsoft to get to, intra ID centric. That was going to be our authentication and authorization platform, and really kind of move away from Azure AD, or I'm sorry, from AD on-prem, which, was our past, right? And get most of our servers and applications into the cloud and things like that. So Cirrus came in, they worked really hard with us. We identified about 5 or so applications that it made sense to actually migrate directly to Intra ID, and we did do that. And then the rest, we went through the Cirrus Bridge. We did use their DNS add-on, so we could do the Cirrus Bridge offline. We could set up our attributes, we could do some testing and things like that. And then in one fell swoop, we'd hit change the DNS, and then that would go into production. So what you can see here after our work with Cirrus is a much more, I guess, straightforward, a well-documented environment, straightforward, and much easier to manage. We did retire Shibboleth. We have reduced our reliance on LDAP, and we want to get away from that. I know that we're a university, so that will never happen ever, but we want to get as far away from that as we can. And then really we're looking at moving everything to the cloud. So this architecture right here prepares us for our future and gives us the flexibility for a truly good, university-based IAM strategy. So this slide right here, this is our common login, and realistically, it looks it's kind of a boring thing because it looks just like the old slide when we were Shibboleth, and it's the same slide. So there was really no significant learning curve for our user community. We had to actually tell them that this happened, and most people were kind of like, "Why are you telling me this?" Because I don't see any change. And so that was, the good part of this story really here is that there was very little change. And that this was our standard authentication screen right here.
Yeah. All right. So what have we learned so far? And we've learned a lot. Much of the information that Stephen alluded to is very true. We are, I would say, definitely started in our identity and access management journey, but the learnings that we had are significant. It was very important, and as you saw, to keep our user experience seamless, and Cirrus did that. There were no changes to customers, and Tyser's feedback was correct. They questioned why we announced it in the first place. So our learnings: don't underestimate the institution's complexity, process complexity, business requirement complexity, and obviously risk in cybersecurity. Don't sacrifice experience for administration. We significantly reduced the processing of our new architecture with Cirrus, and it has been amazing from an operational standpoint. Make sure that the apps that you're planning to migrate currently function as they should prior to migration. So we have a little aha moment here with our research community. So as we were implementing Cirrus Bridge, we were testing very vigorously, and we identified an issue. And one of our research in our research community had already recognized the issue in our prior state was an issue, and they had configured a workaround without IT. And it was a miss on our part from a communication standpoint, but we spent a significant amount of FTE hours trying to remediate and figure out what this issue was. And so after I think a couple of days of really diving deep into the current state and the prior state of our implementation, this came to our attention. And so don't underestimate your community. Engage and collaborate frequently. And then also pay attention to the little details and don't take those for granted either. Vet assumptions. Make sure that the attributes in the former IDM are tweaked and modified and working properly in the new IDM. And then Tyser is going to talk about a couple as well. Stephen?
Sorry about that. Thanks, Elena. I think one of the things we can certainly talk about is attributes, attributes, attributes. We learned a lot about attributes, how to handle them. I don't know, in the community out there, 75 is a lot of applications. It felt like a lot to us, right? And so there were a lot of attributes in there, and some of the wisdom that we pulled out through pain and suffering really was that you need to make sure that you have a good inventory of the attributes and that they're assigned appropriately to the applications. If you're moving them to enter ID directly, you need to make sure that you have those attributes there, or that you have an alternate provider for those attributes. And then also, trying to group applications by attributes. So if you've got applications that have the same, set of attributes, like, in common attributes or custom on campus apps, there's one that we generated as well. You can put those together. And then each one has a separate enterprise application for it. So that was very helpful for us as well. And then also one of the other components that was a huge issue for us and for me as the CISO for the university really is MFA. Our older version was not updated. The way it went through LDAP, MFA was just not physically possible for us as well at that time. On our shibboleth stuff, we do MFA internally at the university. That's a requirement by the state. And so we do that. And that was always a finding for us. And getting over to Cirrus Bridge, getting those resources, the Entra ID resources, we use the Microsoft MFA right now, the Azure MFA. It's a fantastic thing. Most universities have access to it, free applications. So it was a huge win for us as we moved over to this.
Yep. And don't forget to test, and then test again. Constantly validate and test.
Thank you so much, Selena and Stephen. And to anybody who's participating today, if you have any questions for Selena or Stephen, please go ahead and put those in the chat and we will get to those at the end. I heard Stephen made some points that were interesting about attribute handling and how you manage attributes. And I think that kind of harks back to something Corey said earlier. And how people choose to handle attributes in their Entra ID environment is a difference between these community stories. And so I wondered, Corey, if you might want to, before we switch over to Suni Geneseo, just say a few words about what you see in terms of how Microsoft customers tend to make choices about what they put in Entra ID and how they handle those attribute policies.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line there is, a lot of feedback that we received where a lot of customers didn't feel like they could use Entra ID as a directory service, more so even an identity provider, because they just didn't have the objects or the attributes required in the directory. And in some of the scenarios that tend to associate with, one of which was related to, hey, we have requirements around privacy attributes. We need to get those attributes into the authentication flow, but at the current point in time, Entra ID doesn't support, restricting those attributes and making them confidential. I bring that up because although there are other use cases, that feedback actually translated to some feature engineering and development to support the ability for attributes in Entra ID to be marked as confidential and therefore hidden as part of attribute release processes. But that's just a testament to being able to create that feedback loop. Then we know there are scenarios where other use cases where attributes don't exist, kind of inline token augmentation scenarios. And as Stephen mentioned, like the LDAP use cases where that data may never make it to Entra ID. And this also kind of resulted in another kind of feature update, which was related to, being able to inject into Entra ID attributes from third-party attribute stores. right? This feature set didn't exist, but once again, a testament to just some of the feedback coming out of these exercises to say, hey, here's why this is needed. Here's why we can't have the data in Entra ID, and what can Microsoft do? What are the alternatives, and how do we overcome this blocker? So those are just a few of the things that we've heard, and it was interesting to hear Selena and Ty and Stephen talk kind of about how they overcome some of the issues. I think that we could still do a better job of the user experience and kind of the readiness piece, so that we can prevent things being learned on the fly. But there's nothing that's perfect. So yeah.
Sounds great. Thanks, Corey. And I think I'll turn it over to our friends at SUNY Geneseo, David and Jack. Maybe you can introduce yourselves and walk us through sort of your before after initial pain points and lessons learned. And if you could also talk about attribute authority work with Cirrus, since that is a piece that's unique to your deployment here. And I think kind of offers a different perspective on how you might handle some of those issues. So with that, David, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you so much. Hi, I'm David Warden. Before Jack joined, we're a much smaller school than you are, so I've sort of been Geneseo's SSO person since I joined in 2008, and I've kind of been responsible for CAS, Simple SAML, in common, and then our Entra ID federation as we moved into it.
And I'm Jack Truckermiller. As Dave said, I've sort of taken over the IAM stuff that he did with the on-prem things once we moved to Cirrus. I've been with CIT officially for just over a year now, so it's kind of a good first thing to move into. So I'll turn it over to Dave to introduce our challenge.
Sure. I would say, it really all starts with us wanting to get to Entra ID. Specifically, MFA was a big driver. We were we were getting A5, and we wanted to start using MFA. And really that was pushing us to use Entra ID for more things. We already had a CAS instance, we already had a simple SAML PHP instance, and we started by trying to delegate authentication for those two systems to Entra ID, so that when people tried to log into them, they would be authenticating through Entra ID, and then everything else would be handled. The Like people have mentioned already, attributes, and that was something that at this point in time, a lot of these attribute features that Corey mentioned were not yet available. So we were looking around for something that would let us release this attribute that we talk about here, this G number, which we had protected in our local Active Directory, but could not, protect in Entra ID at the time. So at the time, we saw one of those presentations about Cirrus being, a Microsoft recommended solution for achieving this goal of wanting to have people go through Entra ID and release attributes that are not themselves stored in Entra ID. And that sort of is what got us hooked up with Cirrus.
So I'm going to walk us through our sort of before and after. And as Barry mentioned, there's also a bit about the attribute authority feature, so we'll cover that as well. So as Dave mentioned, we had Entra ID sort of as our goal to be the primary identity provider, but because it couldn't do everything we needed, we also had CAS and also a local simple SAML instance running on premises. These were all load balanced to a single address. So while it was easy to implement, if the load balancer had problems, for instance, that was sort of a single point of failure we would encounter. But Entra covered basically all the vanilla SAML and any sort of OAuth stuff CAS obviously did anything that needed CAS authentication, and then our on-premises simple SAML did our in-common multilateral SAML authentication, and it also did any SAML apps that might not be in common but needed those protected attributes that we mentioned. And so it's a little complicated, as you can see, but we then moved with Cirrus to something that's a little nicer. So we still sync Entra and Active Directory because we still use AD for a few things, but we were able to get rid of the on-prem CAS and simple SAML instances so we could define all of our configurations in Entra ID and then use the Cirrus bridge to cover the cases where vanilla Entra might not be able to. So we got both the Cirrus CAS bridge as well as the Cirrus SAML bridge. And so the CAS bridge is able to take care of all the CAS authentication to our apps. And then the SAML bridge is able to take care of any in-common apps and then any of those sort of weird SAML apps that need those protected attributes. And we also, like UARC, purchased the DNS add-on, which was very convenient because we did our testing. And then once we were ready to go, we took the address that had been pointed to the load balance servers and changed DNS to point at Cirrus. And so then everything just basically started working at implementation time, which was very nice. But on top of the two bridges, we also made use of this other nice Cirrus feature called the attribute authority, which is our last slide in the implementation section. So there are some of those attributes that we don't currently have an Entra ID for one reason or another. So what we did was make use of the attribute authority, which is able to connect to our local LDAP and then pull in the missing attributes. And then we made use of the custom claims provider that Entra has to populate them into our SAML claims and pass them on, which is very handy because you can also use it without the Cirrus bridge in some cases to add to your SAML apps and then just pass them right along. So that's a very convenient feature. And so there is one attribute that we did slightly differently, which was member of, because that exceeded the size limits of Entra ID, but Cirrus was able to just directly get that to the like one CAS app that needed it through the bridge and then sent it along. So it's a very handy feature because it lets you fill in the sort of gaps you might have and allows you to run all of those apps. And then this is our login screen. Because we had the delegated authority, this didn't change for anyone. So it was very convenient because we didn't have a bunch of users being like, oh, why are logins different? And we mostly just had to inform the like stakeholders who configure the applications of, oh, we're making this change, so we may need you to help us test. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Dave to talk about our lessons learned.
Thanks, Jack. One thing that we learned, and it sounded like you had this too, going through this exercise really forces you to make a good inventory of all of your services. There's no way to avoid that. That's something that I was not doing the best job of, leading up to it. It's something that was sort of on my plate, never got to it. This exercise forces you to do that, and that's a good thing, I would say. That will help you test. It will help you migrate. It's necessary. So don't try to skip that part or, you know, you have to do that work, unfortunately. It's just the way it is. For us, the attribute authority was very simple to implement. I think Cirrus had great instructions for setting it up, and it worked, and it continues to work, which we're very happy with. We did sort of share with them known peculiarities about how our load balanced LDAP service that we exposed to them works. I don't think they technically need it. They know what they're doing as far as connecting to it, but this is me advocating for sharing with them technical details that you think might help them. Big shout out to that DNS takeover feature or the DNS add-on that people have mentioned. It saved us having to, go through that inventory that we created and, reach out to all those app owners and try and migrate all of them, try and change all of their SAML configuration, which would have been a big lift. So for us, I would say that's worth it. And then lastly, Cirrus has a pretty handy console where you can query the hits to various bridge endpoints in a certain period of time. And we found that to be very helpful for troubleshooting. So if you do become a Cirrus customer, that's something that, whenever somebody asks you to look up like, hey, what happened with this authentication? Or can you see anything that happened with this login? Like, there is something there for you, which we very much appreciate, as we're quite often asked to look up details like that.
Great. Thank you so much, David and Jack. And again, anyone who has questions for David and Jack, please put them in the Q&A. I see that we have quite a lot of questions already in the Q&A, but before we get to that, I'd like to give Corey a couple minutes to give us any sort of tea leaves we can read, things that we might expect to come, things that we can start thinking about now that we're expecting from the Microsoft side that would be relevant to our community. Corey?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line here is learning what we don't know and documenting it, right? So, I don't think the job is done with respect to the reference architecture. So the community may agree with that. We've already kind of talked about, hey, how do we start to better understand some of the additional scenarios like SP initiated use cases for common applications that and application scenarios, also talking about more forward leaning use cases or just things that represent nuances we haven't learned yet. So documenting and getting clarity around additional reference architectures is definitely an area of focus in terms of where we're going. Also, connecting the dots between how the pure academic research and the secure research conversation come together, right? So also being the lead for a lot of the conversation and what happens around secure research, for anyone kind of familiar with that, really fitting into the sensitive research, domain where we're talking about defense industrial based type research for the government, things like CMMC and so forth. So just kind of how those intersection points create better collaboration and user experiences alongside of still meeting the requirements around R&D and so forth. In addition to that, it's just creating better traceability, right? A lot of this comes down to some of the identity driven security conversations, but also being able to get to the last mile across incident response use cases that traverse, we'll call it complex environments. Also while, giving customers an opportunity to get to some cases around more fine grained authorization with things like conditional access and, token protections and so forth. And then lastly, just, staying connected around how do we listen and learn to help enable the future of R&E, right? And some of that comes down to where there may be R&E standards updates. Do we know about them? And also when there are open standard updates, how are we doing a better job of connecting the dots? One example in particular, which I'm super excited about, happens to be with things like verifiable credentials, right? As we start to kind of dissect those types of capabilities and what they mean to data sovereignty and privacy, as well as handling things like attribute release with ledgers and being able to perform confidential attributes, as well as meeting attribute specs and standards like refeds. Here is where, needing to stay abreast of how requirements are changing, but also how we provide guidance in the context of any innovations that are being made in those spaces. That's really kind of where we're going. And, to stay involved, as I mentioned earlier, we did kind of create something referred to as the Identity and Education Community. I know there's a QR code here. This is specifically for identity and education. So if you haven't heard of it or haven't joined it, when we talk about that feedback loop, right, this is where the rubber starts to meet the road in terms of one, being able to share feedback, but then also getting to the point where feedback consensus can be created from the community, right? Because this is where, quite frankly, some things get held up at large companies like Microsoft, that consensus piece being huge. So wanna definitely kind of highlight that. But other than that, keep the feedback rolling. Want to ensure that we're learning what we don't know, and hopefully providing guidance in the areas where we can. So
That's great. Thanks, Corey. So I think we're now at the question part, and I see that we've got quite a lot of questions. So we can move on to looking at those Q&A sections. And I think the first one that jumps out to me is a question for the University of Arkansas or SUNY Geneseo. Did you use ADFS? Have you retired or are planning on retiring ADFS? Did you unfederated change authentication so Enter ID authentication does not redirect to ADFS organization authentication in Enter ID only? So experiences with ADFS, anything that anyone can speak to on that?
I could go first if that's okay. So we mostly did not use ADFS. We had it for one very limited audience, very specific application, and it was retired before this migration. So the short answer is no. We were not big ADFS users at all.
I agree with we're not a big ADFS shop here.
that's good to know, Mary. Because I will say, as evident by some of the reference architecture options, we started to learn that a lot more customers use ADFS in ways that we didn't anticipate in the education landscape. Whether that's daisy chaining ADFS with multiple other IDPs, or using niche features in ADFS, or just simply, as was stated, having some, small number of applications that, may require for some reason. So good to know that maybe it wasn't heavily used in these scenarios, but I think that's an area where we would be very curious of understanding, are there dependencies on ADFS that we're not aware of in some of the architectural patterns or solution patterns that we can better understand. So
Yeah, sounds good. Another question for our university community members. There's a question, and forgive us, Corey, about how other products stacked up against Enter ID in your evaluation. Did you consider alternatives, and what amounted to that decision?
Well, I can say for the University of Arkansas, I mean, right now we're a Microsoft shop. We're licensed for all of our staff and faculty, and we have a student day 5 for our student community. We're moving to Azure. We do have some AWS. Corey, don't listen to that, but we do have a little bit of AWS out there, but we're primarily Azure space right now, and we're moving our servers and things like that. So we had discussed that in the past, but realistically, Enter ID works better for us, if we stay all Microsoft and not dilute that as much as possible. I think Cirrus lines in with that perfectly, and became that match for us.
Great. Any words on how you all handled group management? We have a question about group management when you've removed some reliance from on-prem AD.
That's a big one. I feel like Jack's been doing a lot of work in that field. We are transitioning to try to have our on-prem AD be less of our sort of single source of truth for groups that we just sync to Azure AD. We're also seeing more apps that take advantage of or need or want to use M365 cloud groups. We are also an identity automation customer. So that's sort of what we have been using to try to bridge the gaps, do some cloud group management for things that, we don't want to just sync through. I can't remember the name of that system. Jack, do you remember that? AD Connect Sync, but it got renamed recently.
Oh, it might just be like Azure Sync, but AD Connect Sync is the name I'm more familiar with. But
Azure AD or Entra ID Connect, I guess, is the new name. Microsoft loves naming stuff or renaming it. So, yeah, thank Entra for that. So,
So George says that what he hears is we can buy yet another vendor product to further move our environment away from standards and replace what we're getting for free. What benefits do you see from having done this work? I think that's a pretty key question. I'd love to hear thoughts from folks who've gone through this. What benefits did you see for doing this?
Well, I mean, so one of the benefits is that we have Cirrus helping us, and that's an important part for us because of smaller schools being involved in this. They don't have IT staff to manage this, and we can't manage this for them. So that was a hugely important thing, is to find somebody who can help with IAM as we go forward, in smaller, more diverse schools out there. And then also, I think there's some other, we didn't really talk about this, but there's a lot of other stuff at Cirrus that we use. I mean, IAM is a huge journey for us. I know Selena mentioned Global Campus, which is our, remote, education facility at the University of Arkansas. Also, there's lots of research. Our Walton business or school actually has some data sets from some major vendors, and we offer that out to other schools who do classes on that, right? And we have a lot of others connecting in and actually using resources at the university. So it's a rather complex environment. And, so having Cirrus in there help us, they have some other options and stuff that we're availing ourselves of as we go forward. And then also having them to help advise us and things like that. I think that's a huge benefit for us. I understand, trying not to dilute the identity, stack. But I mean, we view Cirrus as kind of a partner along with Microsoft. So we've got both of them helping us to get to where we need to get.
Thanks, Stephen. And go ahead.
Well, that question stuck out to me too. And I guess I don't know if we can ask or bring this person on, but I guess I am curious, like what standards do you think this is going away from? I guess before to give my own answer, it's to not have to run CAS or Simple SAML anymore. CAS was very hard for me to update. I'm not a Java programmer, and I frequently had to dig into that Java code every time there was a major update to understand what changed and why my last config doesn't work in the new version. So for me, it was not having to run those two apps anymore and getting a robust cloud hosted version of those things.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think I understand from April that we'll be able to follow up to keep the conversation going, and I think we should do that. But to play devil's advocate and say that in my last role, I was going to die on the hill of open source and I could have written this question. But we did get to a point, as I'm sure that Corey can attest, where my desperation was, even if we hold out and we keep running this stuff, if there's no one in the Federation to share resources with, then what's the point? And I think we've always benefited from that heterogeneity of solutions. I think, Corey, we might have a moment for one comment about the fact that the reference architecture by Microsoft is not only saying use Federation adapters. We've focused today's conversation on that, but there are other ways that you can continue to move the infrastructure that you use with the, cloud-based solutions that you have. And Corey, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to sneak in before April takes it away.
Yeah, I mean, I also would be interested in kind of a follow-up on that question of standards that can't be met or that we force the community to move away from, because I do think a lot of this conversation hinges upon meeting standards, right? So, where there are gaps, we need to know that, and not, force education community members to move away from that. But then secondly, as Mary mentioned with the reference architectures, we learned a lot and we saw a lot of different patterns. We couldn't articulate and describe all of them, but the one common denominator was the community needed flexibility and options. And we needed to have some understanding of what are the trade-offs between the options that we knew of to try to articulate them. I won't say it's a perfect product at the moment, but that is something that we need to understand, that with every option, there's trade-offs. If you go the ADFS route, there may be complications in areas we didn't anticipate, but also there may be more complexity, right? And one of our objectives is to, where possible, reduce complexity, improve visibility and standardization. But every customer in education has the ability to potentially move in their own direction based on their journey and where they start. So my hope and intent is that if there is feedback on the reference architecture, if there are more solution scenarios, if there are more trade-offs and lessons learned being identified, feel free to kind of get them to me in any way possible, through Cirrus, through other contexts, because I think the community feedback loop is the piece that really will make this the future of this conversation very fruitful and productive. So.
I think you're muted.
Yep. Thank you so much to Corey, David, Jack, Selena, Stephen, and Mary for a great presentation this afternoon, as well as all of you who attended, whether you asked questions or just listened in. Also want to thank Jennifer from the Internet 2 Meetings team. With their support, we're able to bring you I Am Online each month. I do want to remind you that we have recorded this event, and we will be sharing the slides and the recording with you via email and via the incommon.org website. There is a quick 4-question survey that will pop up for you as you leave the webinar. We'd appreciate it if you take a moment to complete it. We value your feedback. Lastly, we'll be back in February next month with another great program, another webinar featuring the InCommon Catalyst. So please check your email and our website for details. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.